Welcome to Chapter by Chapter. My name is Brian Thomas Kropp, and I will be your host in this episode. Formerly, this show was called the Brian Thomas Kropp Podcast, and I was talking to a friend of mine who said, it might be helpful if you name the show something that if people are looking for a particular thing, the title will make sense as to what it is. And nobody knows what a Brian Thomas Kropp is unless you know me, then you do. And I don't know if that necessarily excites you in listening to a podcast, but chapter by chapter, if you are new to the show, what we do is I'll read a chapter from a book that I have written. In this case, you're on the ground floor. We're starting a brand new book today called Shell Game, which is a second book in a series, but it is a standalone story. So we're going to catch you up. You're going to be fine. But we're going to read that chapter. And then when the chapter is over, you'll get to go a little bit behind the scenes and get a little bit of commentary from me as to why I decided to write what I wanted to write, or go into some Easter eggs that may be hidden in there for those, just a small audience who might have caught it the first time. I'm going to let you know what's going on there, maybe get into a little bit about how books get written. But for the most part, it's just a way to transmit not only the story that I've written, but sort of the heart behind what is written there. So if this is your first episode, so glad that you have joined us. We're going to get into chapter 1 of this second book of the Pearl Saga. It's called Shell Game, right after we hear from this week's sponsors. Prologue. It would do no good to tell you of these strange events that took place in Athens, Kansas, if you weren't first reminded of similar events that happened in the Yukon Territory back in the late 19th century. A young man named Monterey Jack Danvers was hired as a pickpocket to return a stolen gold claim to Mrs. Gladys Finch. On a sea voyage from California to the Northwest Territories, the ship on which Monterey, Mrs. Finch, her daughter Lucy, and their leader Max Sutherland traveled, ran into a fierce storm. The ship was lost, but the foursome survived, finding shelter in a cave which, unknown to them, was a pirate lair. The pirates discovered them and took them by force towards certain doom when the foursome fought back. This action also separated the group to make it out of the pirates' clutches. Mac and the Finches found a direct route out of the cave to the other side of the mountain, whereas Monterey found himself lost deep in the mountain's belly. While down there, Monterey had a surprising turn of events. He became possessed of an orb the size of an oversized pearl, and he encountered an ominous creature dressed entirely in black with his right eye covered by a silver eye patch. The pearl had peculiar qualities that put thoughts and images in Monterey's mind that rescued him from the dangerous inky stranger, guided Monterey out of the mountains and onto a successful journey in the Yukon. As a token of the love that grew between Monterey Danvers and Lucy Finch, the pearl was placed on a gold necklace. This same necklace was buried with Lucy when she died of natural causes in her sunset years. The pearl rested quietly on Lucy's neck, hidden underground, safe from prying eyes for many years, until a flood exhumed Lucy's final resting place, sending the pearl to its next fateful encounter. Now exposed and back in the open, the pearl desperately sought another haven, another carrier to keep it safe till the proper time. Chapter 1. On September 20th, a lingering fog blanketed Athens, Kansas. Evan Gold woke up, sat on the edge of his mattress, raked all 10 fingers through his hair, and stared out the window. Gray. Thick fog blanketed everything, and Evan could no longer see the park, which normally lay opposite his apartment window. The sight matched the thoughts in Evan's head. No detail, no beauty, no nothing. It had been 3 months since he'd moved into the apartment. The partially furnished decorative motif he'd adopted provided the barest of necessities for existence with a proper amount of discomfort to convince him that this was only a temporary situation. All he had to do was get his head straight about a few things, and Catherine would take him back. All he had to do was figure out a whole new way to live, and all would go back to normal. He looked at his alarm clock. 5 after 7. Evan talked himself into standing, then taking a hot shower and shave. His morning routine didn't fix any of his metaphysical problems, but it somehow seemed to give him enough inertia to get on with the rest of his day. At 7:30, Evan exited his house and walked the 5 blocks to the office. On the way, he rehearsed Catherine's grievances. He worked too hard. His clients were unsafe and unsavory. Work kept him out at all times of day and night, and Catherine never knew when he stepped out for the day if it would be the final goodbye. She said she couldn't deal with the fear, with the doubts, with feeling suspicious all the time. Evan couldn't help most of her concerns. He was a private detective. It wasn't like his chosen profession played by the same rules of other businesses. There was no clocking in and out. When he was honest with himself, he knew the job had problems. He'd started with a desire to help people, right wrongs, and fight for justice in an unjust world. Now he was just cynical. Husbands and wives cheated on one another, people stole from each other. Left to their own devices, people only acted out of selfishness, and then hired him to get leverage on other selfish people. Evan considered hanging up his detective agency, but he felt a responsibility to his employees. He had no idea what else he could do to make money and help society. He turned up the collar on his raincoat, jammed his fists into his pockets, and continued to walk forward in the white mist. Catherine was done with him, he told himself. It was just the obvious consequence of his chosen profession. He'd no business getting married in the first place. Evan pulled open the glass panel door and stepped into the silver and gold detective agency. He inhaled the familiar air of linoleum, cigarette ash, and white shoulders perfume. Then he smiled and said, "Good morning," to the source of the fragrance. Sophie Landis looked up from behind her avocado green tanker desk, stopped typing, and smiled at her boss. "That remains to be seen," she said before rubbing non-existent lipstick from her teeth with her index finger. "It's quite the bowl of pea soup out there." "Yeah," Evan said. "Maybe the problems of the world will have a hard time finding us in the haze." Sophie scrunched up her face and shook her head. "I don't think that's going to happen," she said, and handed him an envelope. "A man came by earlier." Evan looked at Sophie, who gave him a weak smile in return. "Welcome to Monday." "Let me take my hat off, at least," he said, and refused to take the envelope. Sophie stood and followed Evan to his inner office. "He was just a courier," she said, and held out the letter again. Evan placed his hat on the rack and took the envelope from Sophie. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" He ran his finger under the flap to break the seal, pulled out the letter, and read it silently. "What does it say?" Sophie asked as he read. "You never can tell with couriers. Their faces don't give you anything to work with." She looked at Evan with a nervous smile and furrowed her forehead. "But it's from the landlord, so..." Evan exhaled, handed the letter back to Sophie, and sat down in his chair. He began to stare out the window at the rest of Athens, Kansas, as it got a start on a new week. Though the window needed soap, water, and a fair amount of elbow grease, Evan usually had a decent enough view of the good people of Athens making their way through the world, little suspecting the existence of their neighbors' darker motives and activities. In the morning's fog, all he could make out were ghostly apparitions gliding through the wisps of gray and white. He mulled on the thought that this was all he ever knew of people, just misty projections. No client he'd ever worked for was honest with him, never came clean, always protecting some angle that made it much harder to find what was good and fair and right. Evan shook his head and rubbed his eyes. What kind of life had he chosen for himself? "Hey, cheer up," Sophie said, refolding the letter and slipping it back into the envelope. "It says we have till the end of the month before they kick us out." Evan grunted. "That's next Friday," he said. Suddenly, Evan spun in his chair and looked at Sophie. "What's outstanding? Aren't there open invoices? There are always open invoices." "Way ahead of you. I looked at our books this morning. Believe it or not, we do have an open invoice, but only one." She scrunched her face again. "That Harvey mess." Evan continued to look passively at Sophie. "And?" "You asked me to have a guy look into it." "And?" "I got the message right after you left on Friday." "And?" Evan parsed. "It would appear the Harveys are running dark. Our guy said they rolled up their whole life like a cheap rug and beat town. They're like ghosts to us." "Them and everyone else." Evan thought as he chewed the inside of his bottom lip. Sophie smiled in apology. I know how to pick the good ones, huh? Evan stood and smoothed his jacket. We got any coffee? Just made a pot, Sophie said, hooking her thumb in the direction of the percolator. She followed him over and hung unnecessarily nearby. I get the feeling you're not done with the good news, he said as he poured the dark liquid into a paper cup. You know what they say about when it rains, Sophie said. What is it they say? Sophie paused and held up a second envelope. We also got a message from the bank. Evan poured powdered creamer and 4 sugar packets into his coffee before turning around and looking his secretary in the eye. Why don't you just tell me what it says? He took a sip and winced as it burned his lip. Sophie looked offended. I don't open your mail. 2 things I know to be true, Evan said after blowing the steam off his cup. You're bad at hiding evidence. What? Sophie said. Evan cocked his head to one side. The letter from the landlord had a weak seal, as if it had been steamed open and resealed. Evan took a sip and walked past Sophie. I'm just concerned about you, Evan. Ever since you moved to that sad little apartment, she hesitated. A person can only take so much bad news. Is that what it is? You're protecting me? What's the other thing? The other thing, I pay you to open my mail, Evan said. The only time you act like I don't is when there's bad news. So out with it. Let's just see how much bad news I can take. Evan, I'm worried about you. Out with it. It says, she said, caressing the envelope's perimeter, it says they're calling in your loan. When? At the end of the month? On Friday? Evan raised his coffee in a salute and said, Welcome to Monday. Sophie followed him back to his office. Listen, Evan, she began, I know this isn't what you want to talk about, but, well, my brother-in-law got in a bad way a few years back. He got back from Korea and tried to make a go of it in prefab houses. Anyway, one thing after another, he filed for bankruptcy. Not this again, she pressed on. Sure, there's been some hardships on getting a car, and he pays more in rent than normal, but he still has a job, and I think in a year or so, it'll all be off his record. After that, he can live a normal life. He said it saved his bacon. I'm a vegetarian, Evan said. Evan, Sophie said. Don't, he said. What? With the tone. What tone? I'm fine. We'll be fine. This is just one of those, whatever these things are called. Would you at least look into it? It might keep you from going down an even deeper hole, Sophie said. I don't want to file bankruptcy. Sophie let out a laugh. No one wants to file bankruptcy, but it might let you live to fight another day. You know, like the Brits over there at Dunkirk. Evan recomposed himself. Sorry, that's nice about your brother-in-law, but I don't want to file. I've never given up a fight yet, and I'm not going to start now. We have, what did it say? We have a week, right? Gabe can rustle up something. He's always getting his nose where it doesn't belong. All we need are 1 or 2 quick payouts, and we can survive another month. Sure, Sophie nodded. That's the spirit. And my brother-in-law gave me the number for his lawyer if you need it. I'm not going to need it, Evan said, anger creeping into his tone. He took a long swallow of his coffee and enjoyed the burn as it ran down his throat and expanded throughout his chest. I said if... Then a light bulb of an idea flashed across Sophie's eyes. Ooh, we could put an ad in the Gazette, a small one. I know how you are about spending money, but there's always somebody doing somebody wrong in Athens. Sure, word of mouth is good, but maybe somebody has a problem and doesn't know someone. They see the ad and, you know. How much does an ad in the Gazette cost? Evan asked. Before Sophie could speak, he answered, More than we have is how much it costs. We're sitting here talking about throwing in the towel 1 minute. I didn't say throw, Sophie tried to interject. And now we're talking about gambling the money we don't have on advertisements when you know that word of mouth has been our best source of paying clients. Our excellent work advertises for us. People say to friends, you need a private eye? See silver and gold. A man's word is more trustworthy than ink on newsprint. Things have always turned around. We've been in much worse scrapes than this before. Things will turn around. Well, if not, Sophie said. I've got that lawyer's number. Evan glared at her. Sophie braced herself with a breath and smiled at her boss. Will there be anything else, Evan? No, he said, and Sophie began to make her way out of his office and back to her desk. Actually, Evan said, stopping her, you could check the county records to see if I happen to have a rich relative that's looking to kick off soon. They shared a humorless smirk. Sure, I'll get right on that. So like I said, there's a sort of a 2-for-1. If you've been following along with the podcast for a while, a lot of that prologue, you know all that very, very well. And if you are unfamiliar with book 1 in the Pearl Saga, then you can hop back to episode 17 of this podcast, and you can start in with Showdown in the Yukon, or you can jump over to Amazon or Audible and the audiobook, minus all of this kind of commentary. That audiobook is now available over at Audible, and you can grab a copy. You can grab a book copy if you want to as well. It should be available in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle, as well as audiobook now at this point. The only real interesting thing, other than sort of, I guess, why I wrote a prologue. The long story with this particular book, again, if you've heard this podcast a lot, you know this. I wrote a draft of what became Shell Game, and then I had some friends read it, and they said they didn't like the main character. And I think so I rewrote quite a bit of it. And then one of the other comments was, and if I hadn't read the first book, I wouldn't know what on earth is happening. It's just a very different book. So I did write a prologue to kind of catch anybody up in case you jumped in at book 2, and it provided a way to highlight the part in Showdown that was going to drive Shell Game, which was the finding of the Pearl, and it being the Pearl Saga, and we'll kind of see how that plays out over the course of time. One of the things I wanted to do with this series was the Pearl shows up in book 1 and has not a completely different personality, but you see a greater depth of a thing that didn't seem that important in book 1 now takes on a greater importance in book 2 and has an even greater importance in book 3. So we'll see how that goes in this book. Now, to cover some things that happen in chapter 1 that are probably only mildly interesting to just a small group of people, but one of them is me. So there you go. One of them is that Evan Gold walks into his office for the first time. Just all of these senses get kicked in with the smell of cigarette ash and linoleum floor and White Shoulders perfume. And that is a nod to my mom, who I don't know if she still wears this or not, but when I was growing up, that was her perfume of choice, was White Shoulders. So there you go, Mom. Also, Athens is a thinly veiled, for those who live there or have lived there, it's just a thinly veiled veneer of fiction over a very real town that I grew up in called Emporia, Kansas. And the reason I came up with Athens, and I've used Athens, Kansas to sort of have a wink and a nod over at my growing up for a number of projects now. But there was I think possibly one of the only famous people out of Emporia, Kansas was, his name was William Allen White, and he was a newspaper editor of the Emporia Gazette. So the Athens Gazette is a reference to the Emporia Gazette, and he was a big deal back in the early 1900s, was friends with Teddy Roosevelt and some of the movers and shakers in the industrial age back then. And he wrote an article about Emporia called The Athens of the Plains. Emporia being, I think at the time, one of those progressive towns full of idealism and what the new century could bring out there on the plains. And so I just sort of stole Athens as a code for Emporia. So as we go through this book, some of the locations have been changed to protect the innocent. But for a lot of this, I actually looked at a map of Emporia and tried to map out if Evan Gold lived where I think he lives in Emporia and worked where I think he works, then what streets would he have to go down, all that kind of stuff. So you could almost follow this on a map. But I think the biggest issue that I'm going to run into with this particular book and this series is that each book is a different style genre. So if the first book was sort of a westerny adventure, this is a crime noir book. And so if you're a fan of wagons and gold mines and Old West kind of stuff, you're going to get dropped into this book and go, what on earth is happening, if you're a big fan of that? Or if you were frustrated by, I don't like dust and gold mines and revolvers and all the things that were in Showdown, but I like crime stuff, this might be more up your alley. Book 3 is even a different genre. So there you go. I'm told this is not how you write series. How you write a series is to stay in your lane and do that over and over and over again. And I grew up in theater, and in theater, if you do the same thing over and over again, you end up being called typecast, and I didn't want that. So I'm not doing the smart thing. I'm just writing the stories as they come along. So we're going to do a crime noir. Also kind of a nod to my mom. She raised me to watch oh gosh, during summer vacations, we would watch Hitchcock movies and Murder, She Wrote and Charlie's Angels and Columbo and all these whodunit kind of things. And so unraveling this kind of puzzle is sort of a thing that I enjoy still to this day. And I even got a comment back from her after she read the book. It's like, I really liked this a little bit better. It's kind of more in her vein. So anyway, that's kind of what's going on in chapter 1, just kind of getting stuff set up. Oh, I almost forgot. A very important thing, if you're writing a book, an important detail to have to kind of drive a plot forward is to have a ticking clock of some variety. It kind of puts pressure on some stuff. And sort of a mild ticking clock in this is that Evan has some financial troubles, and if you can just get those taken care of, then by next Friday, by the 1st of the month, then he might be able to float his business. The other side of that is, if he does decide to float his business, then what happens to his marriage? So there are these kinds of questions that are outside of the realm of the crime that we're about to get into. But that's a kind of thing that's driving all this. So the very rocky start to this new adventure of Shell Game. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy getting in on the ground floor of this one, and tell your friends and family about the show and the book. And you can do that. Obviously, you can just call them up and say things, but you can also leave a rating and review on the places where you do those things. You can pick up a copy of Shell Game. It's now out in it's over in Amazon, and you can read along. You can read ahead. You can just fast forward through all the chapter part and get to all this stuff if that's interesting to you. But I'm excited to continue this adventure on, and glad to have you along for the ride. So we'll be back with chapter 2 next time. And until then, I hope you have a great week.